Ladies and gentlemen, if you are enjoying my videos, please click the like button. It is the only way the YouTube algorithm really notices me. I would be very grateful to you. Anton's life had become a bleak and monotonous routine, one that seemed to echo the eternal stillness of the graveyard where he worked as a night watchman. After a series of devastating personal and family tragedies, he found himself in this morbid occupation, a stark contrast to the once promising career he had imagined for himself. The cemetery, shrouded in mist and shadow, was his world now. It was a desolate place where the only sounds were the whispers of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. Each night, Anton would walk the winding paths between the tombstones, his footsteps the only interruption to the silence. The moon, when it appeared, cast an eerie glow over the marble and granite markers, highlighting the names of those long forgotten. Isolation had become his constant companion. The living had turned their backs on him, and he, in turn, had embraced the company of the dead. The rows of silent graves were his audience as he patrolled the grounds, his flashlight piercing the darkness but never revealing anything beyond the lifeless monuments. The cemetery was a world apart from the bustling life beyond its iron gates, a place where time seemed to stand still. Anton's existence had narrowed to this grim duty, a job he took out of sheer necessity after losing his mother and watching his family disintegrate. Once a respected teacher, his descent into the bottle had cost him everything: his career, his reputation, his home. Now, his only solace came from the bottom of a flask, a brief escape from the relentless march of regret and sorrow that haunted his every step. Each night, as he roamed among the dead, he grappled with his thoughts. He reflected on his past mistakes, the what-ifs and might-have-beens that had led him here. The cemetery's oppressive atmosphere mirrored his own feelings of despair and hopelessness. The tall, dark trees stood like sentinels, guarding the secrets buried beneath the soil, and the cold, hard ground seemed to absorb his every sigh and whisper. Despite the setting, Anton remained a skeptic when it came to the supernatural. To him, the cemetery was merely a place of stones and bones, devoid of ghosts or spirits. Yet, the isolation and the eerie stillness often played tricks on his mind. Shadows seemed to move just beyond the reach of his flashlight, and the sensation of being watched never fully left him. He chalked it up to his frayed nerves and the solitude that weighed heavily on his soul. His once bright future now lay buried beneath layers of regret and loss. The prestigious career he had aspired to was gone, replaced by a life among the tombstones. The cemetery, with its decaying flowers and weathered inscriptions, served as a constant reminder of his own decay. He had become a relic of his former self, trapped in a purgatory of his own making. As Anton walked his nightly rounds, the weight of his isolation grew heavier. The grave markers stood as silent witnesses to his downfall, each one a symbol of a life cut short, much like his own potential. The cold air bit at his skin, and the darkness pressed in from all sides, but he trudged on, a solitary figure in a sea of the dead. His existence had become a living nightmare, a grim testament to the consequences of his choices and the inescapable grip of his own personal demons. After losing his mother and witnessing the disintegration of his family, Anton's life spiraled into chaos. His descent into alcoholism had destroyed his once promising career and alienated those he loved. Desperation and necessity drove him to seek employment as a night watchman at the local cemetery, a place that mirrored his own sense of desolation and loss. The job was far from glamorous. It was a last resort, a grim solution to his immediate need for survival. Anton needed the meager income to sustain himself, but more than that, he needed the isolation it provided. The graveyard offered a stark refuge, a place where he could retreat from the prying eyes and judgmental whispers of the living. Here, among the silent tombstones, he could grapple with his grief and remorse in solitude. The cemetery, with its cold, unyielding headstones and mournful atmosphere, seemed like the perfect place for a man who had lost everything. It was a world apart from the vibrant life he once knew, a place where the dead lay undisturbed and the living rarely ventured. For Anton, it was a sanctuary from his overwhelming sense of failure and sorrow. Working as a night watchman gave him a purpose, albeit a grim one. His nights were spent patrolling the labyrinthine paths between graves, ensuring that the resting place of the dead remained undisturbed. The monotony of his duties provided a strange sense of comfort, a rhythm to his otherwise chaotic existence. In the silence of the cemetery, he found a perverse kind of peace, a stark contrast to the turmoil that had characterized his recent years. Anton's motivations for taking the job were deeply entwined with his need to escape his past. The loss of his mother had been a devastating blow, but it was the subsequent unraveling of his family that truly shattered him. His marriage fell apart, his wife leaving him in the wake of scandal and disgrace. The home they had built together became a battleground of accusations and regrets, and eventually an empty shell echoing with memories of better times. In the cemetery, Anton could almost feel the presence of his mother, a ghostly comfort in his darkest hours. The job allowed him to distance himself from the world that had judged and rejected him. The graveyard's oppressive atmosphere seemed to absorb his sorrow, offering a bleak companionship that he couldn't find among the living. Here, he was just another lost soul among many, his failures and regrets blending into the background of forgotten lives. Yet, despite the grim nature of his surroundings, Anton clung to his role with a tenacity born of desperation. The cemetery represented a form of penance, a way to atone for his past mistakes. Each night, as he walked among the graves, he confronted his own mortality and the choices that had led him here. The weight of his grief and guilt was palpable, hanging in the cold night air like a shroud. In this somber setting, Anton's life found a grim rhythm. The cemetery, with its decaying monuments and overgrown paths, became a mirror of his own broken existence. His motivation for working there was not just financial, it was a means of grappling with his inner demons, a way to process his grief and find some semblance of meaning in his shattered life. The dead, with their eternal silence, offered him a kind of acceptance he could no longer find in the world of the living. Anton was surrounded by a sea of gravestones and silent graves, a stark reminder of his isolation and estrangement from the living. Each night, he wandered through this morbid landscape, his footsteps the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. The cemetery was vast and desolate, its ancient trees casting twisted shadows that seemed to reach out and ensnare him in their cold embrace. The tombstones, weathered by time and neglect, stood as silent sentinels, each one a monument to a life that had ended. These markers of death were his only companions, their engraved names and dates a mute testimony to the passage of time and the finality of existence. As he patrolled the grounds, Anton often felt as if the dead were the only ones who could understand his profound sense of loss and despair. The living had turned their backs on him. His fall from grace had been swift and unforgiving. Once a respected teacher, he was now a pariah, shunned and whispered about by those who had once called him friend. The scandal that had ruined his career and his marriage had also stripped him of his social ties, leaving him adrift in a sea of isolation. The cemetery, with its somber stillness, was a fitting reflection of his inner turmoil. Each night, the chill of the graveyard seeped into his bones, amplifying his sense of desolation. The cold air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, a constant reminder of the finality that awaited everyone. Anton found a grim comfort in this, feeling more at home among the dead than he ever could among the living. Here, he did not have to face the judgmental eyes or hear the whispered accusations that haunted his waking hours. The graves, with their ornate crosses and simple markers, seemed to echo his own feelings of entrapment. Just as the dead lay confined in their eternal resting places, so too was Anton trapped in a prison of his own making. His life had become a repetitive cycle of night shifts and solitary walks, punctuated by moments of bleak introspection. The weight of his failures pressed down on him, a constant reminder of what he had lost and could never regain. In the eerie light of the moon, the cemetery took on a spectral quality. Shadows danced and shifted, creating the illusion of movement among the graves. Anton's mind often played tricks on him, the oppressive loneliness magnifying every creak and rustle into something sinister. Yet he welcomed these moments of fear, for they broke the monotony of his otherwise lifeless existence. His isolation was not just physical but emotional. He had become a ghost of his former self, wandering the graveyard in search of something he could not name. The few people he encountered during his rare forays into town treated him with a mixture of pity and fear, their averted gazes a painful reminder of his fall from grace. The cemetery, with its unfeeling stones and silent graves, offered him a refuge from their scorn. Anton's days blended into nights, each one indistinguishable from the last. The cemetery's endless rows of graves became a labyrinth in which he wandered aimlessly, lost in his own thoughts. The dead, with their eternal silence, provided a stark contrast to the noise and chaos of the life he had left behind. Here, among the forgotten and the forsaken, he found a semblance of peace, however cold and unwelcoming it might be. As he walked the cemetery's paths, Anton often pondered the nature of his own existence. He felt as though he had become one of the very ghosts he guarded, a specter haunting the edges of life and death. The isolation and hopelessness that permeated his soul were mirrored in the desolate landscape around him, each gravestone a silent witness to his unending sorrow. In this place of death, Anton's life had found a grim purpose. The isolation that once threatened to consume him had become his solace, the unyielding presence of the graves a testament to his own enduring despair. As he continued his nightly vigil, he knew that the cemetery, with its cold embrace and endless silence, was both his prison and his sanctuary, a place where his isolation and hopelessness were etched in stone. Anton approached the cemetery with a pragmatic outlook, seeing it purely as a place of work rather than a domain of supernatural phenomena. While others might shiver at the thought of spending their nights among the dead, he dismissed such fears as mere superstition. To him, the cemetery was simply a collection of stones and earth, devoid of ghosts or spirits. His skepticism was rooted in his past as a man of education and reason. Even as his life unraveled, he clung to rationality as a lifeline. Stories of haunted graves and restless spirits were for the gullible, not for someone who had seen the harsh realities of life up close. Each gravestone represented a life that had ended, nothing more. The dead were gone, leaving behind only their names and dates etched in stone. During his nightly patrols, Anton found the repetitive tasks almost meditative, checking the perimeter, ensuring the gates were secure, and making sure no vandals disturbed the peace of the graveyard. These were straightforward duties. He often scoffed at the tales of those who claimed to have seen apparitions or heard eerie whispers among the tombstones. The cemetery, with its orderly rows and meticulously kept grounds, was a place of final rest and reflection, not a stage for ghostly dramas. Anton viewed his surroundings with a kind of clinical detachment. The mist that rolled in from the hills, the moon casting long shadows, the occasional hoot of an owl, these were all natural occurrences, stripped of any mystical connotations by his logical mind. He often thought back to his days as a teacher, where he encouraged his students to question and seek evidence. This same approach colored his view of the cemetery. While others might let their imaginations run wild, Anton remained firmly grounded. The only spirits he believed in were those found in bottles, and even they had brought him nothing but misery. The graveyard was simply a place where the dead were laid to rest, and the living came to remember them. Despite the eerie atmosphere, Anton felt a sense of control within the cemetery's boundaries. The solid, unyielding presence of the tombstones and the predictable routine of his job provided a structure that his life sorely lacked. There was comfort in the tangibility of his tasks, a stark contrast to the chaotic and uncontrollable events that had led him here. The dead, in their silence, offered no surprises. Yet there were moments when the oppressive stillness of the graveyard made him uneasy. He would catch himself glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow flit across his path. These fleeting sensations of dread he quickly dismissed as tricks of the mind, remnants of a once active imagination now dulled by alcohol and sorrow. He had more pressing concerns than ghost stories, namely, the struggle to maintain his tenuous grip on sanity and purpose. Anton's utilitarian view of the cemetery extended to his interactions with the living as well. When mourners visited, he treated them with a respectful detachment, ensuring they had the privacy they sought without indulging in their emotional displays. To him, the rituals of grief were as practical as his duties necessary, perhaps even cathartic, but ultimately grounded in the physical world. The flowers left on graves, the candles lit in memory, were gestures he could understand and respect, even if he did not share in the belief behind them. In his heart, Anton knew that the real horrors of life were found among the living. The betrayals, the losses, the relentless march of time, these were the true ghosts that haunted him. The cemetery, with its quiet and order, was a refuge from these specters. It was a place where he could confront his demons in peace, far from the chaos that had once engulfed him. As he walked among the graves each night, Anton remained a skeptic, grounded in his belief that the cemetery was nothing more than a final resting place. The mysteries of life and death were complex enough without adding supernatural elements. For him, the true mystery lay in how he would find a way to live with his past, and whether he could ever find peace in a world that had left him so utterly alone. Anton's life was a tapestry of squandered potential and missed opportunities, woven together by the threads of his own poor choices and the cruel hand of fate. Once a respected teacher, he had enjoyed a prestigious career that brought him not only a sense of accomplishment, but also a solid social standing. His days were filled with the joy of imparting knowledge and the respect of both colleagues and students. He was a figure of authority, admired for his intellect and dedication. But that was before the collapse. A series of tragic events and personal failures had forced Anton to abandon his once promising career. The turning point was a scandal that shattered his life. Accusations, whether true or exaggerated, had erupted around him, staining his reputation beyond repair. What had begun as whispers grew into a storm of condemnation, ultimately leading to his dismissal. The fallout was swift and brutal, leaving him with little more than the clothes on his back and the bitter taste of betrayal in his mouth. The respect he once commanded turned into disdain. Friends and colleagues distanced themselves, eager to avoid the taint of association. Parents withdrew their children from his tutoring sessions, and the school board acted with ruthless efficiency to sever ties. Overnight, Anton went from being a pillar of the community to a pariah. The loss of his career was not just a professional blow, but a personal one, striking at the core of his identity. Anton's descent was rapid and unrelenting. With his career in ruins, he turned to alcohol, seeking solace in the bottom of a bottle. His once orderly life spiraled into chaos as he struggled to find purpose in the wreckage of his former existence. The drinking provided a temporary escape, but it also deepened his sense of hopelessness. Opportunities that once lay before him like a banquet now seemed like cruel illusions, tantalizingly out of reach. Living with his mother offered little respite. Her disappointment was palpable, and their home, once a sanctuary, became a prison of unspoken resentments. As the months dragged on, Anton's savings dwindled, and he found himself unable to secure stable employment. His reputation followed him like a shadow, tainting every potential job prospect. Employers were wary of hiring someone with such a controversial past, and even the most menial jobs seemed beyond his grasp. Eventually, the cemetery job came along, a position so far removed from his former life that it felt like a cruel joke. Yet, he accepted it out of sheer desperation. As a night watchman, he found himself surrounded by the dead, a fitting metaphor for his own perceived life's end. The cemetery, with its silence and shadows, became a reflection of his inner turmoil, a place where dreams lay buried and forgotten. The gravestones he patrolled each night were stark reminders of lives that had ended, much like the life he once knew. Each stone represented a story cut short, a future unrealized. Anton saw his own fate mirrored in the names and dates etched in granite, a sobering reminder of the fragility of reputation and the finality of lost opportunities. His once bright future had dimmed, leaving him to navigate the twilight of his existence in the company of the dead. In the quiet moments between his rounds, Anton often reflected on what might have been. He envisioned classrooms filled with eager faces, lectures that sparked curiosity, and a career that could have made a difference. These thoughts were both a comfort and a torment, highlighting the chasm between his past aspirations and his present reality. The cemetery's cold, indifferent atmosphere provided a stark contrast to the warmth and vibrancy of the life he had once known. The weight of his lost potential bore down on him, a constant reminder of his fall from grace. The isolation of his job only intensified his feelings of inadequacy and despair. There were no colleagues to commiserate with, no students to inspire. His interactions were limited to the occasional mourner and the ever-present dead, both of which offered little in the way of companionship or solace. Anton's life had become a grim routine, devoid of the passion and purpose that once drove him. The opportunities he had squandered haunted him, their absence a glaring void that no amount of alcohol or denial could fill. Each night, as he walked among the graves, he felt the weight of his lost future pressing down on him, a relentless reminder of the man he had once been and the potential that had slipped through his fingers. Anton's descent into alcoholism began subtly, almost imperceptibly, as a coping mechanism to numb the pain of mounting pressures and personal disappointments. What started as a glass of whiskey in the evening soon became an entire bottle, and the ritualistic escape into intoxication turned into a nightly necessity. His wife, Larissa, initially tried to support him, believing it to be a temporary lapse. She had hoped that he would regain his footing, that the man she married would re-emerge from the shadows of his despair. Their life together had once been a picturesque tableau of domestic happiness. They lived in a modest but cozy home, filled with laughter and dreams of the future. Anton's position as a teacher brought stability and respect, while Larissa's dedication to her career added a sense of shared accomplishment. They planned for children, vacations, and a lifetime of togetherness, building their own world on a foundation of mutual love and trust. However, the insidious grip of alcohol began to erode this idyllic existence. Anton's increasingly erratic behavior and frequent absences chipped away at the trust they had built. Arguments became a common occurrence, with Larissa's pleas for him to seek help falling on deaf ears. Anton, blinded by his addiction, could not see the toll it was taking on his marriage. His once clear mind, now clouded by liquor, failed to grasp the severity of the situation. The breaking point came one fateful night when Anton, in a drunken stupor, left a cigarette burning in their living room. Larissa was out with friends, and Anton, unable to stay awake, fell into a deep sleep on the couch. The smoldering cigarette soon ignited a fire, which spread rapidly through their home. By the time Larissa returned, the house was engulfed in flames. She found Anton unconscious and barely breathing amidst the smoke and chaos. The fire department managed to save Anton's life, but the damage was irreversible. Their home was reduced to charred remains, a physical manifestation of the ruin that had befallen their relationship. Larissa, her eyes filled with tears and a heart heavy with despair, realized that the man she loved had become a stranger, a dangerous one at that. The fire had not only destroyed their belongings, but also their sense of security and trust. In the aftermath, as Anton recovered in the hospital, Larissa made a heart-wrenching decision. She could no longer stand by and watch as he destroyed both himself and their future together. With a mixture of sorrow and resolve, she packed her belongings and left, filing for divorce shortly thereafter. The separation was swift and merciless, a clean cut that left Anton reeling. For Anton, the loss of Larissa was a devastating blow. It stripped him of the last vestiges of stability in his life. Alone and burdened with guilt, he spiraled further into his addiction, using alcohol to drown the relentless pangs of regret and sorrow. He was haunted by the image of Larissa's tear-streaked face and the charred ruins of their home, symbols of his profound failures. The aftermath of the fire and the divorce left Anton adrift. He moved in with his mother, a woman whose patience was tested by his continuing decline. Her home, once a place of refuge, became a battleground of unspoken tensions and dashed hopes. Anton's presence was a constant reminder of what could have been, a daily reenactment of missed opportunities and broken promises. As Anton's addiction deepened, his career prospects evaporated. His once impressive resume and teaching credentials became relics of a past he could no longer claim. Potential employers, wary of his reputation and the whispers of scandal, offered no solace. The respect and status he once enjoyed were replaced by pity and scorn. Anton became a ghost in his own life, moving through the days without purpose or direction. The consequences of his actions were inescapable. Each night, as he patrolled the cemetery, he was reminded of the life he had lost and the family he had destroyed. The graves around him served as a stark metaphor for his own buried dreams and the love he had let slip away. The silence of the cemetery mirrored the emptiness within him, a constant reminder of his failures and the irreversible damage he had wrought. In his darkest moments, Anton grappled with the reality of his situation. He realized that the cemetery, with its solitude and silence, was a fitting purgatory for a man who had lost everything. His nights were filled with haunting memories of Larissa and the life they had planned together, now reduced to ashes and regrets. The family he had envisioned was gone, leaving him to wander among the dead, a living testament to the tragic consequences of his own weaknesses. Every night, Anton's life unfolded like a macabre ritual. dictated by the monotonous demands of his job as the cemetery's night watchman. His world had shrunk to a realm of tombstones and shadows, where the living dared not venture and the dead held silent dominion. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he would leave his small, decrepit cabin at the edge of the cemetery and step into the twilight, the crisp air carrying the faint scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. Anton's routine was as unwavering as the graves he patrolled. Armed with a heavy flashlight and a rusted set of keys, he would traverse the winding paths of the cemetery, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen pine needles. The beam of his flashlight swept over weathered headstones, casting fleeting illuminations on names and dates etched into stone, some barely legible through the creeping ivy and moss. Each grave was a story, a testament to lives lived and lost, yet to Anton, they were merely markers of his own relentless solitude. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. It was a silence that weighed heavily on his shoulders, pressing down with a force that seemed almost tangible. He had no company save for the inanimate residents of the cemetery, whose mute presence served as a constant reminder of his isolation. There were no conversations, no laughter, only the whispering wind and the steady crunch of gravel underfoot. His rounds were methodical, an unchanging sequence that mirrored the predictability of his existence. He would check the gates, ensuring they were securely locked against the potential intrusion of vandals or thrill-seeking teenagers. He would walk the perimeter, scanning for any signs of disturbance or trespass. Yet, night after night, there was nothing but the undisturbed stillness of the cemetery, as if the dead themselves were guarding their own peace. Occasionally, Anton would pause by certain graves, his eyes lingering on the names and dates as he pondered the lives that had preceded the stones. Some were ancient, dating back to times he could scarcely imagine, while others were fresh, their flowers still vibrant with the remnants of recent grief. He felt a strange kinship with these silent sentinels, a sense of belonging that eluded him among the living. In their eternal rest, they seemed to offer him a kind of grim solace, an acceptance of his own downward spiral. His breaks were spent in the confines of his cabin, a cramped space cluttered with relics of his former life. A battered kettle, a chipped mug, and a small television that only received static-laden channels were his only luxuries. He would brew himself a cup of instant coffee, the bitter taste a stark contrast to the warmth it provided. Sometimes he would switch on the TV, the flickering screen casting eerie shadows on the walls, but the disjointed images offered no comfort. As the hours dragged on, the darkness seemed to deepen, wrapping around him like a shroud. The cemetery took on an almost sentient quality, its shadows shifting and stretching as if alive. Anton often felt as though he were being watched, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck that refused to abate. Yet, whenever he turned, there was nothing but the endless rows of gravestones and the enveloping gloom. The routine was both a curse and a lifeline, providing structure to his otherwise aimless existence. It was a job that demanded vigilance but offered no respite from his inner demons. Each night was a stark reminder of his isolation, a vigil over the dead that echoed the emptiness within his own soul. The cemetery, with its cold, silent stones, was both his sanctuary and his prison, a place where he could escape the judgment of the living but never the haunting memories of his past. As dawn approached, Anton would complete his final round, the first light of morning casting long shadows over the graves. He would return to his cabin, the exhaustion of another sleepless night weighing heavily on him. There, in the dim light of early morning, he would collapse onto his cot, his mind swirling with the ghosts of his failures and regrets. Sleep came fitfully, a restless plunge into dreams that were often more unsettling than the reality he faced upon waking. In this endless cycle of night and day, Anton found a grim acceptance. The cemetery was his purgatory, a place where he could atone for his sins in the quiet company of the dead. It was a life devoid of joy, but it was his life, a penance he felt he deserved. And so, each night he would rise and resume his solitary vigil, a lonely watchman in a world of shadows and silence, forever bound to the graves he guarded. Alcohol had woven itself into the very fabric of Anton's existence, becoming both his refuge and his ruin. In the dimly lit recesses of his cabin at the cemetery, bottles lined the shelves like sentinels, their contents offering a temporary escape from the relentless torment of his thoughts. Each night, as he patrolled the cemetery, the flask hidden in his coat pocket became a comforting weight, a promise of oblivion that he would soon indulge. The habit had started innocuously enough, a glass of whiskey to soothe his nerves after a particularly grueling day. But what began as a solitary indulgence quickly spiraled into a dependency. The numbing warmth of alcohol provided a respite from the crushing despair that had enveloped his life following the collapse of his marriage and career. It dulled the edges of his guilt and regret, blurring the painful memories into a haze that he could momentarily escape. Yet this escape came at a steep cost. The alcohol that granted him brief reprieves also steadily dismantled the remnants of his former life. As a teacher, Anton had once been respected and admired, a man of intellect and compassion. His passion for education had inspired his students, and his colleagues had looked up to him as a beacon of wisdom. But as his reliance on alcohol grew, so did his unreliability and erratic behavior. He began arriving late to work, his breath tinged with the telltale scent of liquor, his eyes bloodshot and vacant. The administration was initially sympathetic, attributing his lapses to the personal tragedies he had endured. However, their patience wore thin as Anton's conduct became increasingly unpredictable. He missed important meetings, neglected his responsibilities, and once even showed up to class visibly intoxicated. The final straw came when he was found passed out in his car in the school parking lot, a half-empty bottle of vodka on the passenger seat. The scandal was swift and unforgiving. Parents demanded his resignation, and the school board had no choice but to terminate his employment. Stripped of his career and the respect it had afforded him, Anton's descent into alcoholism accelerated. The community that once held him in high esteem now shunned him, their whispered judgments and scornful glances driving him deeper into isolation. He withdrew from social circles, preferring the solitary company of his bottles to the painful reminders of his failures. Friends who tried to reach out were met with hostility or indifference, their concern brushed aside by a man who had resigned himself to his fate. Living with his mother offered little solace. The relationship, strained by his persistent drinking, deteriorated further. She watched helplessly as her son, once full of potential, wasted away before her eyes. Her pleas for him to seek help were met with empty promises and broken vows. The house, once a place of warmth and familial bonds, became a battleground of recriminations and sorrow. When Anton finally moved out and took the job as the cemetery watchman, it was both a retreat and a concession to his addiction. The isolation of the cemetery provided him with the perfect cover to indulge his habit without scrutiny. Nights were spent in a fog of alcohol-induced stupor, his senses dulled to the eerie quiet of the graveyard around him. He would often sit in his cabin, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls, a bottle in hand and his mind adrift in a sea of melancholic reflections. The alcohol that once offered solace now consumed him. His health began to deteriorate, the toll of years of heavy drinking manifesting in trembling hands, sallow skin, and a perpetual weariness that no amount of sleep could alleviate. His mind, once sharp and inquisitive, became clouded and sluggish. Even the simple task of patrolling the cemetery grew arduous, each step feeling like a monumental effort. In his rare moments of clarity, Anton recognized the vicious cycle he was trapped in. He knew that the alcohol was destroying him, that it was the root of his ruined relationships and shattered career. Yet the grip of addiction was too strong. The fear of facing his demons sober was more terrifying than the slow death he was succumbing to. The cemetery, with its endless rows of tombstones, seemed a fitting backdrop to his life, a place where dreams were buried and hope lay interred. Every night, as he raised the bottle to his lips, Anton felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The alcohol that blurred the edges of his reality also chained him to a path of self-destruction. His life had become a somber tale of lost potential and squandered opportunities, narrated in the quiet clink of glass bottles in the somber shadows of the cemetery. And as the nights grew longer and the darkness more profound, Anton found himself sinking ever deeper into the abyss, a ghost among the graves he watched over. In the profound solitude of his nightly vigils, Anton's mind frequently wandered into the realms of deep philosophical thought. The cemetery, with its silent testimonies to lives once lived, became a fitting stage for his contemplations on the nature of existence, death, and the infinite. The ceaseless quiet, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the trees or the distant cry of a night bird, provided a stark backdrop to his musings. As he patrolled the shadowy paths between the graves, Anton found himself grappling with questions that had haunted humanity for centuries. What was the purpose of life? What lay beyond the veil of death? These thoughts were his companions in the darkness, as tangible and persistent as the cold night air. He would often pause by the older graves, their inscriptions worn by time, and ponder the lives those buried beneath had led. Did they achieve their dreams? Did they leave this world with regrets? These graves, some neglected and overgrown, spoke to him of the fleeting nature of human ambition and the inexorable march of time. Anton's reflections were not merely abstract, they were deeply personal, born from his own experiences and the ruinous path his life had taken. He had once believed in the promise of a bright future, in the power of knowledge and education to shape lives and society. But his fall from grace had shattered those beliefs, leaving him adrift in a sea of cynicism and despair. Now, in the presence of the dead, he questioned the very foundations of his former convictions. He spoke aloud to himself, the sound of his voice a comfort against the oppressive silence. What is it all for, he would ask, his words lost among the tombstones. We strive, we suffer, and in the end, we all end up here, in the cold ground. His voice often wavered with the weight of his thoughts, a blend of sorrow and resignation. These conversations with himself became a nightly ritual, a way to externalize the turmoil within. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, the only source of light in the oppressive blackness. As he approached the old caretaker's shack, he noticed something strange. A group of figures stood clustered near the entrance, their dark silhouettes stark against the faint glow of the lantern inside. Anton's heart skipped a beat. Visitors were rare at this hour, and the unexpected presence filled him with a sense of foreboding. He narrowed his eyes, focusing the flashlight on the group. The beam revealed a cluster of teenagers, their faces pale and eyes wide with nervous excitement. They were dressed in Gothic attire, black clothes, heavy boots, and silver jewelry glinting in the flashlight's glare. Their appearance was striking, anachronistic against the somber backdrop of the cemetery. "What are you doing here?" Anton demanded, his voice rough and wary. His unease grew as he observed them, their presence an unsettling anomaly in his isolated world. The teenagers exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of defiance and unease. One of them, a tall boy with dark eyeliner and a studded leather jacket, stepped forward. "We're just looking around," he said, his tone casual but edged with nervousness. "It's just a bit of fun." Anton felt a surge of irritation. Fun was the last thing he associated with this place. "This is private property," he said, his voice gruff. "You shouldn't be here, especially not at night." The boy shrugged, a smirk playing on his lips. "We're not doing any harm, just exploring." Anton's eyes scanned the group, noting their fidgeting hands and darting eyes. Something about their presence felt wrong, like they were intruding on sacred ground. He took a step closer, the beam of his flashlight moving from face to face. "Exploring a cemetery at night isn't a game," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You need to leave." A girl with long, dyed black hair and pale makeup spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. "We heard about this place, about the legends. We wanted to see if they were true." Anton's irritation gave way to a chilling sense of dread. The cemetery had a reputation, stories of ghosts and restless spirits. He had dismissed them as folklore, but the fear in the teenager's eyes suggested they took the tales seriously. "Legends are just stories," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "This is not a place for your games." The girl stepped forward, her eyes wide with something between curiosity and fear. "But we heard screams," she insisted. From over there, she pointed towards the older section of the cemetery, where the tombstones were worn and the air seemed colder. Anton's blood ran cold. The memory of the scream he had heard earlier resurfaced, sending a shiver down his spine. He turned his gaze towards the direction the girl indicated, the darkness seeming to deepen. "You heard screams?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The teenagers nodded in unison, their bravado melting away. The boy who had spoken earlier looked genuinely afraid now. Yes, it was real. We thought someone might be in trouble. Anton's mind raced. If there were screams, it meant someone or something was out there. He couldn't dismiss it as a mere prank anymore. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice firm, despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "Do not move." He turned and started towards the older part of the cemetery, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the darkness. His heart pounded in his chest, each step taking him further from the relative safety of the caretaker's shack and closer to the unknown. The teenager's presence had disrupted the eerie peace of the cemetery, and now he was walking into what felt like the heart of a nightmare. As he moved deeper into the cemetery, the shadows seemed to close in around him, the silence pressing against his ears. He could almost hear the whispers of the dead, feel their eyes on him. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of old branches seemed amplified, echoing his own growing dread. Reaching the section the girl had pointed to, he scanned the area with his flashlight. The old tombstones loomed like ancient sentinels, their inscriptions worn and unreadable. The air was colder here, more oppressive. He called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Is anyone there?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the shadows, he thought he saw movement. His flashlight wavered, illuminating the figure of a boy, his face contorted in terror, before he vanished into the darkness again. Anton's heart skipped a beat. The legends, the screams, the teenagers, they all collided in his mind, forming a terrifying picture. With a deep breath, Anton steeled himself and pressed on, knowing that whatever awaited him in the darkness, he had to face it. The cemetery, once a place of silent reflection and sorrow, had become a nightmarish landscape of fear and uncertainty. And he was right in the middle of it, with no way out but through the encroaching darkness. The tension in the air was palpable as Anton stood facing the group of teenagers, his hand trembling as it clutched a pistol. The darkness of the cemetery seemed to close in around them, the oppressive silence broken only by their hurried, anxious breaths. The moon, hidden behind thick clouds, offered no solace, leaving the flashlight beam as the only feeble light in the vast sea of shadows. Anton's heart raced, his mind a whirlwind of fear and anger. He had found the teenagers near the old mausoleum, their pale faces stark against the black backdrop of night. Their Gothic attire, once merely peculiar, now seemed sinister, as if they were creatures of the night themselves. They had invaded his space, brought chaos into his already fractured world. "Put the gun down," one of the boys demanded, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and defiance. He was tall, with dark eyeliner that accentuated the fear in his wide eyes. "We didn't do anything wrong." Anton's grip tightened on the pistol. The weight of it was both reassuring and terrifying. He had never intended to use it, had only brought it as a last resort in case of grave danger. But now, faced with the unpredictable actions of these intruders, he felt cornered. "You have no business here," he growled, his voice rough with desperation. "Get out. Now." A girl with long black hair and a piercing in her nose stepped forward, her hands raised in a placating gesture. "We heard screams," she said, her voice trembling. "We thought someone needed help. We're not here to cause trouble." Help. Anton's laugh was harsh and hollow, echoing through the still night. "This place is nothing but trouble. You shouldn't be here. Especially not at night." The boy who had spoken first took a step closer, his hands clenched into fists. "We didn't ask for this," he said, anger flashing in his eyes. "We were just curious. You're the one threatening us." Anton could feel the situation spiraling out of control. The teenagers were frightened, but also emboldened by their numbers. He was alone, armed, and increasingly aware of how dangerously close he was to losing control. "I don't care why you're here," he snapped, his voice rising. "You need to leave, or I'll call the police." "Go ahead," the boy shot back, his bravado masking his fear. "We didn't do anything illegal. We're not vandals." A flicker of doubt crossed Anton's mind. What if they were telling the truth? What if they really had heard screams? The memory of the terrified boy he had glimpsed earlier surfaced, adding to his confusion. But the gun in his hand was a constant reminder of the power he held and the precariousness of his own position. He couldn't afford to show weakness. "Get out," Anton repeated, his voice low and menacing. This is your last warning." The girl looked at her friends, uncertainty in her eyes. "Maybe we should go," she said softly. "This isn't worth it." But the boy was not ready to back down. "No," he said firmly. "We're not leaving just because some crazy guy with a gun tells us to. We have a right to be here." Anton's patience snapped. "A right," he shouted, his voice echoing off the tombstones. "This is not a playground. It's a graveyard, and if you don't leave, you'll regret it." The boy flinched, but stood his ground. "You're the one who'll regret it if you shoot us," he said, his voice shaking. "You'll go to prison." The standoff stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. The cemetery around them seemed to hold its breath, the shadows growing deeper and more menacing. Anton's mind raced, struggling to find a way out of this nightmare. He knew he couldn't shoot, but the threat alone was tearing him apart inside. Then, without warning, a piercing scream split the air, coming from deeper within the cemetery. It was a sound of pure terror, raw and primal. The teenagers' faces went pale, their defiance replaced by sheer panic. The girl grabbed the boy's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to go," she whispered urgently. Anton's blood ran cold. The scream was real, and it was close. Too close. His eyes darted around, searching the darkness for any sign of movement. The pistol in his hand felt like a useless toy against whatever horror lurked in the shadows. "Go," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Get out of here, now." The teenagers needed no further prompting. They turned and fled, their footsteps echoing through the night as they disappeared into the darkness. Anton watched them go, the pistol hanging limply at his side. The scream had changed everything. It was no longer just a matter of intruders and threats. Something was out there, something far worse than rebellious teenagers. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He had to find out what was happening. He had to protect the cemetery and himself from whatever darkness had been unleashed. With a final glance at the retreating figures, Anton turned towards the source of the scream, his flashlight cutting through the night. The cemetery had never felt more ominous, more alive with unseen terrors. And Anton, armed and alone, was walking straight into its heart. Anton stood frozen in the thick darkness of the cemetery, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The flashlight in his hand wavered, casting erratic beams of light that danced across the tombstones and twisted shadows into monstrous shapes. His grip on the pistol slackened, the cold metal suddenly feeling alien and heavy in his hand. The echo of the scream still reverberated in his ears, a chilling reminder of his isolation and helplessness. The teenagers had scattered, their panicked footsteps fading into the night, leaving Anton alone with his mounting fear and the oppressive silence of the graveyard. He felt a wave of intense disappointment wash over him. Here he was, a grown man, armed and supposedly in control, yet utterly incapable of handling the situation. The realization stung, cutting deeper than any physical wound. He had failed to assert his authority, failed to protect the sanctity of the cemetery, and now, with the threat of something far more sinister lurking in the shadows, he felt paralyzed by indecision and fear. His mind raced, but every thought led to a dead end. Calling for help was futile. The cemetery was too remote, and his reputation too tarnished for anyone to take his pleas seriously. He had become a ghost of his former self, a mere shadow skulking in the darkness, powerless and insignificant. His fingers fumbled for his phone, a lifeline to the outside world that now seemed impossibly distant. The screen illuminated his gaunt, haggard face, highlighting the lines of worry etched deeply into his skin. He dialed the number for the local police, his hands trembling so badly he almost dropped the phone. But even as he pressed it to his ear, he knew it was pointless. The line rang and rang, each unanswered tone a cruel reminder of his isolation. "Come on, pick up," he muttered through clenched teeth, his eyes darting around the cemetery. He imagined all manner of horrors lurking just beyond the reach of his flashlight, their eyes watching him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The phone finally went to voicemail, and Anton cursed under his breath, his frustration boiling over into a moment of sheer panic. He wanted to scream, to lash out at the tombstones, at the trees, at the unseen terrors that seemed to encroach upon him from all sides. but he knew it would be pointless. His cries would be swallowed by the night, unheard and unanswered. He felt a crushing weight of despair settle on his shoulders, a sense of failure so profound it left him breathless. The disappointment wasn't just in his inability to handle the situation. It was in the realization that he had allowed himself to sink to this point. Once a respected teacher, now a pathetic figure haunting the cemetery, driven by ghosts of his past and fears of the unknown. The stark contrast between who he had been and who he had become was a bitter pill to swallow. He stumbled to a nearby bench, collapsing onto it as the enormity of his failure bore down on him. He buried his face in his hands, the pistol slipping from his grip and clattering to the ground. The sound echoed through the silence, a stark reminder of his impotence. He couldn't protect anyone, not even himself. Anton sat there for what felt like an eternity, his mind a swirling maelstrom of fear, disappointment, and self-loathing. He wanted to run, to flee from the cemetery and never look back, but he knew he couldn't. He was tethered to this place by his own failures and regrets, a prisoner of his past mistakes. The scream, the teenagers, the unseen threat, all of it was a grim reminder of the darkness that had seeped into his soul. Finally, with a deep, shuddering breath, he forced himself to stand. He retrieved the pistol, though it felt like a hollow gesture, a flimsy shield against the nightmares closing in around him. His legs felt like lead, every step a monumental effort as he resumed his patrol. The cemetery was vast and full of secrets, and he was just one broken man trying to keep the darkness at bay. As he moved through the shadowed rows of tombstones, the sense of impending doom grew stronger. He knew he had to face whatever was out there, not just for the sake of the cemetery, but for his own shattered sense of self. The fear was still there, gnawing at his insides, but it was tempered by a grim determination. He had failed tonight, but the night was not over. There was still a chance, however slim, to reclaim a shred of his former self. And so he walked on, into the heart of the darkness, hoping against hope that he could find a way to redeem himself before it was too late. The oppressive night weighed heavily on Anton's shoulders as he stood facing the group of teenagers. The flashlight in his hand cast long, wavering shadows across the gravestones, and the gun he clutched felt like a lead weight. The teens, clad in Gothic attire, mirrored his nervousness with their own apprehensive glances and defensive stances. Tension crackled in the air, thick enough to be felt. Anton's heart pounded in his chest, a relentless drumbeat of fear and indecision. His threats had done little to disperse the group, and his own sense of powerlessness only deepened. The realization that he was spiraling out of control gnawed at him. He had tried to protect the sanctity of the cemetery, to assert his authority, but now, faced with a situation that had rapidly slipped through his fingers, he felt utterly impotent. "Look," Anton finally said, his voice hoarse and trembling. "This is getting us nowhere." He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I'm going to call the police." His words hung in the air, met with a mixture of relief and suspicion from the teenagers. They exchanged wary glances, their tense postures relaxing just a fraction. The leader of the group, a boy with dark eyeliner and a studded collar, eyed Anton cautiously. "And you expect us to trust you?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of skepticism. Anton nodded, lowering the gun slowly to show he meant no harm. "I don't want anyone to get hurt," he said, his eyes pleading for understanding. "Let's let the authorities handle this." With deliberate slowness, Anton pulled out his phone, the small screen illuminating his gaunt face. His fingers shook as he dialed the number, each press of a button echoing loudly in the stillness of the night. The teenagers watched him intently, their expressions a mix of fear and hope. The call connected, and Anton spoke quickly, his voice a strained whisper. "This is Anton Petrov, the night watchman at the cemetery. There's been an incident, and I need police assistance immediately." He paused, listening to the operator's questions. "Yes, some teenagers. No, no one's hurt, but there's something's not right here." As he spoke, Anton's eyes scanned the surroundings, his mind racing. The earlier scream still haunted him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were all in imminent danger. His gaze flickered over the tombstones, expecting at any moment to see some lurking menace. The operator assured him that help was on the way, and Anton ended the call, slipping the phone back into his pocket. He looked at the teenagers, their faces now painted with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. "The police are coming," he said, his voice firm despite the turmoil inside him. "We just need to wait here together." The girl with the nose piercing stepped forward, her eyes wide with anxiety. "Do you think we're in danger?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Anton hesitated, not wanting to frighten them further. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we'll be safer if we stay together until the police arrive." They huddled closer, the flickering flashlight their only beacon in the encroaching darkness. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, each rustle of the wind and creak of old trees amplifying their collective unease. Anton tried to project calm, but inside, his mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. He had always prided himself on being able to handle whatever life threw at him, but tonight had shattered that illusion. As they waited, Anton couldn't help but reflect on how he had arrived at this moment. His life had become a series of missteps and regrets, leading him to this desolate place, both physically and emotionally. The cemetery, once a refuge from his troubled past, now felt like a prison, each gravestone a reminder of his failures. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps broke through his reverie. Anton's heart leapt into his throat, and he tightened his grip on the flashlight. The teenagers tensed, their eyes wide with fear. But then, emerging from the shadows, were two uniformed police officers, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Anton exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief washed over him, mingled with the residual fear of the unknown threat still lurking somewhere in the cemetery. He stepped forward to meet the officers, his body trembling with exhaustion and anxiety. The lead officer, a tall man with a stern expression, glanced around the group. "Who called in the disturbance?" he asked, his tone brisk and professional. "I did," Anton replied, trying to steady his voice. "I'm the night watchman here. These teenagers. They heard a scream. There's something out there." The officer's eyes narrowed. "We'll investigate. In the meantime, stay together and keep your lights on," he motioned for his partner to follow, and the two officers disappeared into the darkness, their flashlights bobbing with each step. Anton and the teenagers remained where they were, a fragile island of light in a sea of darkness. The wait was torturous, every moment stretching Anton's nerves to the breaking point. But for the first time that night, he felt a flicker of hope. Help had arrived. Maybe, just maybe, they would make it through the night. As the minutes ticked by, Anton's thoughts turned inward once more. Tonight had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated, forcing him to confront his deepest fears and insecurities. He had faltered, but in calling for help, he had also taken a step toward reclaiming a part of himself that he thought was lost forever. He vowed silently that no matter what happened next, he would face it head-on, not as a broken man, but as someone determined to find his way back to a life worth living. The night had settled into an eerie stillness, the only sounds the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Anton moved through the rows of gravestones, his flashlight casting long, creeping shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. His senses were heightened, every nerve in his body alert to the slightest disturbance. It was during this heightened state of awareness that he noticed a group of figures huddled near the entrance of the cemetery. His heart quickened as he approached, the beam of his flashlight revealing a group of teenagers, their faces pale and anxious in the stark light. They were dressed in dark, Gothic clothing, their appearance a stark contrast to the somber surroundings of the cemetery. Anton's initial reaction was one of irritation mixed with suspicion. Teenagers on a cemetery at night often meant trouble. "What are you doing here?" Anton demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. The flashlight's beam settled on the face of the apparent leader, a boy with black eyeliner and piercings. "We're looking for our friend," the boy replied, his voice shaky but defiant. "He was supposed to meet us here, but we can't find him." Anton frowned, lowering the flashlight slightly but not his guard. "This is no place for games. Do you have any idea how dangerous it can be out here at night?" "We're not playing games," another teen, a girl with brightly colored hair, interjected. "His name is Tim. He texted us saying he was at the old part of the cemetery, but now he's not answering his phone." Anton's irritation gave way to a creeping sense of dread. The old part of the cemetery was notorious, shrouded in local legends and whispered tales of eerie happenings. Despite his skepticism, he knew that place held a particular unease, even for someone like him who spent his nights among the dead. "How long has he been missing?" Anton asked, trying to keep the urgency out of his voice. "About an hour," the leader replied. "We thought he was just messing with us at first, but now we're really worried." Anton looked at their faces, saw the genuine fear there, and felt a pang of sympathy. Despite their rebellious appearances, they were just kids, scared for their friend. He sighed, his resolve hardening. "All right," he said, "I'll help you look for him, but you stay close to me. No wandering off." The teenagers nodded, relief washing over their faces. Anton turned and led the way deeper into the cemetery, his flashlight guiding their path. The further they went, the colder and more oppressive the air seemed to become. The gravestones in this part were older, more weathered, their inscriptions barely readable through the encroaching moss and ivy. "Tim," Anton called out, his voice echoing eerily through the stillness. "Tim, if you're out here, answer us." The only response was the whisper of the wind through the trees. The teenagers clung together, their earlier bravado evaporating with each step deeper into the cemetery. Anton could feel their fear, and it only served to amplify his own. The sense of being watched, of something unseen lurking just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam, was almost palpable. As they continued to search, Anton couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The cemetery was vast, but it was not the kind of place one could easily get lost in, especially not someone familiar with the local area. He kept his thoughts to himself, not wanting to alarm the teenagers any more than they already were. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from behind a nearby mausoleum. The group froze, every eye fixed on the source of the noise. Anton signaled for the teenagers to stay back and cautiously approached, his flashlight held high. "Tim," he called out again, his voice tense. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the shadows, a figure stumbled forward, disheveled and wide-eyed. It was a young boy, no older than 16, his face streaked with dirt and tears. "Help me," he croaked, his voice raw with fear. Anton rushed forward, catching the boy as he collapsed. "Tim," he asked, and the boy nodded weakly. "We need to get out of here," Tim whispered urgently. "There's something out there. Something terrible." The group didn't need any more encouragement. Anton helped Tim to his feet, and they hurried back towards the cemetery gates, the oppressive darkness closing in behind them. As they moved, Anton couldn't help but glance over his shoulder, half expecting to see some monstrous figure emerging from the shadows. They reached the gates and practically tumbled out into the relative safety of the streetlights. The teenagers gathered around Tim, bombarding him with questions, but Anton's mind was elsewhere. He stared back into the cemetery, a cold chill running down his spine. Something was out there, something that had left Tim terrified and broken. As he stood there, the realization dawned on him that the night's events were far from over. The cemetery, with all its secrets and shadows, held more than just the dead. And Anton, the solitary watchman, was now tangled in a mystery that was only beginning to unravel. The night air was thick with tension as Anton faced the group of teenagers. Their gothic attire and defiant expressions only fueled his irritation. The cemetery was supposed to be a place of solitude, not a hangout for reckless youths. Anton could feel his patience wearing thin as he tightened his grip on the flashlight, its beam flickering slightly, as if sensing his agitation. "What are you really doing here?" Anton's voice was sharp, carrying an edge of suspicion. "This is no place for kids to be messing around." The leader of the group, a tall boy with black eyeliner and numerous piercings, stepped forward. "We told you, we're looking for our friend," he repeated, frustration evident in his tone. "His name is Tim. We think something might have happened to him." Anton narrowed his eyes, the flickering light casting eerie shadows across his gaunt features. "And you expect me to believe that? Kids like you don't just wander into cemeteries at night for no reason." A girl with brightly colored hair stepped up beside the leader, her voice trembling slightly. "We're not lying. Tim was supposed to meet us here. He sent us a text saying he was at the old part of the cemetery." Then he stopped responding. The mention of the old part of the cemetery sent a shiver down Anton's spine. It was a place shrouded in local legend, avoided even by those who had no fear of the dead. He looked at the teenagers, their fear and desperation slowly chipping away at his initial disbelief. "Why didn't you call the police?" Anton demanded, though he already suspected the answer. The leader scoffed. "And tell them what? That our friend went missing in a creepy old cemetery? They wouldn't take us seriously." Anton sighed heavily, feeling the weight of the situation press down on him. Despite his reluctance to get involved, he couldn't ignore the genuine fear in their eyes. "All right," he said grudgingly, "but if we're going to find your friend, you do exactly as I say. No wandering off. Understood?" The teenagers nodded, a mix of relief and anxiety crossing their faces. Anton could feel their eyes on him, filled with a blend of hope and skepticism. He turned away, gesturing for them to follow as he led the way towards the older, more sinister section of the cemetery. As they walked, the tension between them was palpable. Anton could sense the teenagers' distrust, their whispered conversations and nervous glances only heightening his own unease. He tried to push down his irritation, focusing instead on the task at hand. "You kids better not be messing with me," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for them to hear. "We're not," the girl with the colored hair insisted. "We're just scared. We don't know where Tim could be." The path grew narrower and more overgrown as they ventured deeper into the cemetery. The ancient tombstones loomed like silent sentinels, their inscriptions worn and barely legible. Anton's flashlight cast long, ghostly shadows that seemed to flicker and dance just beyond the edge of vision. A rustling sound from behind a nearby mausoleum made everyone freeze. Anton raised his flashlight, his heart pounding in his chest. "Stay here," he ordered, moving cautiously towards the source of the noise. As he rounded the corner, the beam of light fell on a small, crumbling structure. The rustling grew louder, more frantic. Anton's mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. His grip tightened on the flashlight as he prepared for the worst. Suddenly, a figure stumbled out from the shadows. It was Tim, his face pale and streaked with dirt, his eyes wide with terror. "Help me," he gasped, collapsing at Anton's feet. The teenagers rushed forward, their relief palpable. Anton helped Tim to his feet, glancing around warily. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. Tim shook his head, trembling. "I don't know. I thought I saw something. Someone. Then I got lost, and I think something's out there." Anton felt a chill creep up his spine. The cemetery seemed to close in around them, the darkness pressing down like a tangible force. He knew they needed to get out, and fast. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "Let's get out of here. Stay close and keep quiet." The group moved quickly, the oppressive silence broken only by their hurried footsteps. Anton couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something malevolent lurked just beyond the reach of his flashlight. As they finally emerged from the depths of the cemetery, Anton felt a sense of relief wash over him. The streetlights ahead seemed like beacons of safety in the darkness, but he couldn't forget the fear in Tim's eyes, or the sense of dread that had settled over him like a shroud. He turned to the teenagers, his voice stern but not unkind. "Next time, stay away from this place. It's not safe, not for anyone." They nodded, their faces pale and solemn. As they hurried away, Anton watched them go, a heavy sense of foreboding settling in his chest. The cemetery held its secrets close, and tonight, they had only just begun to uncover them. As the group huddled near the weathered stone of an old mausoleum, Anton's eyes narrowed with suspicion. The teenagers, still catching their breath from their panicked flight, exchanged nervous glances. Their leader, a tall boy with a haunted expression, took a step forward. "Look," he began, his voice trembling but determined, "we came here because our friend Tim went missing. He was supposed to meet us at the old part of the cemetery. He sent us a text, and then nothing. We tried calling him, but his phone just goes straight to voicemail." Anton felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. "Your friend went missing here," he repeated, his voice laced with incredulity. "Why would he come to a place like this at night? Didn't he know how dangerous it is?" The girl with brightly colored hair spoke up, her voice edged with desperation. "He was curious about the old cemetery, the part that's supposed to be haunted. We dared him to go there, and he agreed. But when we got his last message, he sounded scared. He said he saw something moving in the shadows. The words hung in the air, sending a chill down Anton's spine. He glanced around at the ancient, decrepit tombstones, their inscriptions barely visible in the dim light. The idea of a teenager wandering alone in this forsaken place was unsettling, to say the least. "How long has he been missing?" Anton asked, trying to maintain a semblance of control over the situation. "About an hour," the leader replied, his voice strained. "We searched everywhere we could think of, but this place is like a maze. And then we ran into you." Anton rubbed his temples, the flickering beam of his flashlight casting erratic shadows. "Why didn't you call the police?" he asked, though he could already guess the answer. The girl with the colored hair shook her head. "We thought they'd think we were pranking them. We didn't want to get in trouble. But now, we're really scared." Anton took a deep breath, trying to quell the unease that gnawed at him. The idea of a young boy lost in this labyrinthine cemetery, potentially in danger, was not something he could ignore, no matter how much he wanted to. "All right," he said, his voice firming with resolve. "We need to find your friend and get out of here. Stay close to me and follow my lead. If Tim's still here, we'll find him." The teenagers nodded, their fear evident, but their hope rekindled by Anton's determination. He led them deeper into the cemetery, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. Each step echoed with the crunch of gravel, and the air grew colder, as if the spirits of the dead were watching their every move. As they ventured further, the silence became more pronounced, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. The old part of the cemetery loomed ahead, its tombstones older and more elaborate, draped in ivy and shadows. Anton couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone, that unseen eyes were tracking their progress. The leader of the teenagers, his voice barely a whisper, pointed towards a cluster of particularly ancient graves. "That's where Tim was headed," he said, his eyes wide with fear. "He wanted to check out that old mausoleum." Anton nodded, his grip tightening on the flashlight. "Stay close," he repeated, more for his own reassurance than theirs. They moved as one, their breaths shallow and their nerves taut, towards the foreboding structure. Reaching the mausoleum, Anton shone his light over the crumbling facade. The heavy iron door stood ajar, creaking slightly in the night breeze. He pushed it open with a reluctant creak, revealing a dark, musty interior. "Tim," Anton called, his voice echoing eerily off the stone walls. There was no response, only the oppressive silence of the tomb. He stepped inside, the teenagers huddling close behind him. The beam of his flashlight swept across the room, illuminating dusty sarcophagi and cobweb-covered corners. In the far corner, something caught the light, a crumpled figure lying motionless on the cold stone floor. "Tim," the girl cried, rushing forward. Anton quickly followed, his heart pounding in his chest. Tim lay there, pale and shivering, but alive. His eyes fluttered open, and he let out a weak, relieved sigh. "I thought I'd never see anyone again," he whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. Anton helped him to his feet, his mind racing. Whatever had scared the boy so badly, it was clear that they needed to leave this place immediately. "Let's get out of here," Anton said, guiding the group back towards the entrance. The cemetery seemed even more menacing now, its dark secrets pressing in on them from all sides. As they made their way back to the safety of the streetlights, Anton couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something ancient and malevolent. He vowed never to let curiosity lead him or anyone else into the heart of the cemetery's darkness again. As the group gathered their wits and began to make their way out of the mausoleum, the conversation shifted to the eerie legends that surrounded the cemetery. It was the girl with brightly colored hair who first mentioned it, her voice still trembling from the recent scare. "Have you ever heard the story of the old burial ground?" she asked, her eyes darting nervously to the shadows that seemed to dance just beyond the reach of their flashlights. Anton frowned, not entirely sure he wanted to delve into local folklore in the middle of the night, especially in such a haunting setting. "I've heard bits and pieces," he admitted, trying to keep his voice steady. "What about it?" The girl glanced at her companions before continuing. They say there's an old section of the cemetery that dates back to before the town was even founded, hidden deep in the woods. It's not on any maps, and there are no records of it. But people have reported strange sightings and sounds coming from that area. Some claim it's a place where the dead don't rest easy. Anton felt a chill creep up his spine. The cemetery was already a place of sorrow and silence, but the idea of an even older, hidden section filled with restless spirits was deeply unsettling. "And you think your friend went looking for this old burial ground?" he asked, trying to keep the skepticism out of his voice. The boy who had been leading the group nodded. Tim was always fascinated by ghost stories and legends. He talked about the old burial ground like it was some sort of adventure. We didn't think he'd actually go looking for it, but now. His voice trailed off, and he swallowed hard. Anton glanced around at the ancient tombstones, their inscriptions worn away by time. The idea that there could be an even older section, filled with untold stories and possibly malevolent spirits, gnawed at him. "Let's hope we don't run into anything worse tonight," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. The girl with colored hair continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There are tales of people who went looking for the old burial ground and never came back. They say you can hear their voices on the wind, calling for help. Some folks in town swear they've seen ghostly figures wandering the woods at night, looking for a way out." Anton shook his head, trying to dispel the growing sense of dread. "Legends and ghost stories," he said, forcing a grin. "But we should focus on getting out of here and getting Tim home safe." As they made their way through the twisted paths of the cemetery, the stories hung in the air like a thick fog, each step echoing the legends of lost souls and haunted grounds. Anton couldn't help but feel the weight of the past pressing down on them, as if the very land they walked on was steeped in sorrow and secrets. Despite his efforts to dismiss the tales as mere superstition, Anton's mind kept drifting back to the idea of the old burial ground. Was it possible that such a place existed, hidden away from the prying eyes of the living? And if it did, what horrors might it hold? The thought made him quicken his pace, urging the teenagers to stay close and keep moving. The night seemed to close in around them, the darkness growing thicker and more oppressive with each passing moment. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made Anton's heart race. The cemetery, which had always been a place of quiet and solitude, now felt like a labyrinth of nightmares, where the past refused to stay buried. Finally, they emerged from the dense thicket of gravestones and trees, the distant glow of streetlights offering a semblance of safety. Anton breathed a sigh of relief, though the unease lingered. He had a feeling that the cemetery's secrets were not so easily left behind. As they crossed the threshold back into the realm of the living, the girl with colored hair looked back over her shoulder, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. "Do you think the legends are true?" she asked quietly. Anton didn't answer right away. Instead, he gazed back at the dark expanse of the cemetery, its secrets hidden beneath layers of time and earth. "Let's just say some stories are better left unexplored," he replied finally, guiding them back towards the safety of the town. The cemetery behind them seemed to whisper with the voices of the past, a reminder that some legends are born from truths that are too unsettling to confront. The cemetery was bathed in an eerie glow as Anton led the group of teenagers through the shadowed pathways. The air was thick with tension, each step resonating with the weight of unspoken fears. The night was colder than usual, and the wind whispered secrets through the leaves of ancient trees. As they navigated the labyrinthine grounds, Anton couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over him. It was as if the very essence of the place was conspiring to bring his worst memories to the surface. He glanced at the teenagers, noting their nervous glances and hushed whispers. They were a motley crew, dressed in dark, gothic attire that contrasted starkly with the solemnity of the cemetery. One girl, in particular, seemed to hold his gaze longer than the others. Her face, partially obscured by dyed black hair, sparked a painful recollection in Anton's mind. It was a face that bore a striking resemblance to someone he had known long ago, someone tied to a dark chapter in his life. "Mr. Ivanov," she said suddenly, her voice piercing the uneasy silence. "You don't remember me, do you?" Anton stopped in his tracks, the words hitting him like a physical blow, He turned to face her fully, his eyes narrowing as he tried to place her. The girl smirked, a hint of bitterness in her expression. "I'm Vera," she continued, crossing her arms defensively. "Vera Petrov. I was in your history class before. Well, before everything went to hell." Recognition dawned, and with it, a surge of conflicting emotions. Vera Petrov had been a bright, albeit rebellious, student in his class years ago. She had been present during the scandal that had destroyed his career and reputation, a scandal that had painted him as a villain in the eyes of the community. "Vera," Anton said, his voice strained. "It's been a long time." "Yeah," she replied, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "A lot has changed since then. Or maybe not so much. You still seem to be getting yourself into trouble." The other teenagers watched the exchange with wide eyes, sensing the underlying tension. Anton felt his hands clench into fists, old wounds tearing open with every word. He had hoped to leave his past behind, to bury it as deeply as the bodies he now watched over. But here it was, resurrected and standing before him in the form of a former student. "This isn't the time or place for this," Anton said, trying to keep his voice level. "We're here to find your friend and get you all out safely." Vera stepped closer, her eyes burning with a mix of anger and defiance. "You think you can just play the hero now? After everything? You ruined lives, Mr. Ivanov. You ruined my life." Anton felt a pang of guilt and defensiveness. "I never meant for any of that to happen. It was a misunderstanding, a horrible misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. Vera's voice rose, echoing through the cemetery. "You call what happened to me and my family a misunderstanding? You were drunk, you crossed lines, and people got hurt." The other teenagers shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught in the crossfire of a history they didn't fully understand. Anton took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The weight of his past mistakes pressed down on him, threatening to crush his resolve. "I'm sorry, Vera," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I truly am. But right now we need to focus on finding your friend. Can we do that, please?" Vera's eyes searched his, looking for sincerity. After a tense moment, she nodded curtly. "Fine, but this conversation isn't over." The group continued their search, but the atmosphere was thick with unresolved tension. Anton couldn't shake the feeling that the cemetery was a living entity, feeding off their emotions and fears. Every shadow seemed to hide a ghost of his past, every rustle of leaves a whisper of accusations. As they delved deeper into the dark heart of the cemetery, Anton felt a cold sweat break out on his brow. The lines between the living and the dead, the past and the present, seemed to blur. And with each step he wondered if he was leading them towards salvation or deeper into a nightmare from which they might never escape. Anton Ivanov's career had once been the epitome of respect and promise. As a high school history teacher, he was well regarded by both colleagues and students. His classes were engaging, his passion for the subject palpable. He was seen as a beacon of knowledge and a pillar of the community. However, that all came crashing down one fateful evening. It had been a cold, rainy night when the incident occurred. Anton had agreed to give a private tutoring session to one of his students, a bright but troubled girl named Elena. She was struggling with her coursework, and Anton, ever the dedicated teacher, offered to help her catch up. They met in his classroom after hours, the dim lighting and echoing hallways creating an atmosphere that was both eerie and intimate. Elena was nervous, her usual bravado absent. Anton, sensing her unease, tried to reassure her with his usual gentle demeanor. They worked through her history assignments, the rain pattering against the windows like the ticking of a countdown. As the evening wore on, the conversation strayed from academics to more personal topics. Elena opened up about her struggles at home, her feelings of isolation. Anton listened, offering what comfort he could. But then, something went terribly wrong. As Elena began to cry, Anton made the grave mistake of attempting to console her with a hug. What was intended as a gesture of comfort quickly spiraled out of control. A colleague, passing by the classroom, saw the embrace and jumped to conclusions. By the time the rumors started to spread, the story had morphed into something far more sinister. Within days, the school was abuzz with whispers and accusations. parents demanded answers, the administration launched an investigation, and Anton found himself at the center of a scandal he couldn't escape. Despite his protests and Alina's insistence that nothing inappropriate had happened, the damage was done. The school board, eager to quell the outrage, decided to terminate his employment. The dismissal was a public affair, covered by local news and discussed in hushed tones throughout the community. Anton's reputation, painstakingly built over years, was shattered overnight. Former colleagues turned their backs on him, parents warned their children to stay away, and students who once looked up to him now eyed him with suspicion and disdain. Unable to find work in his chosen profession, Anton retreated from public life. His marriage, already strained, couldn't withstand the pressure of the scandal. His wife, Larissa, unable to cope with the constant scrutiny and gossip, left him. She took their daughter, Irina, and filed for divorce. Anton, now utterly alone, turned to alcohol to numb the pain. As he spiraled further into despair, Anton's once promising future faded into a series of drunken nights and forgotten days. His savings dwindled, and he was eventually forced to take a job far beneath his qualifications. The role of a night watchman at a cemetery was both a punishment and a refuge, a place where he could hide from the world and his own shame. The cemetery became his home, a place where he could exist without the constant reminders of his fall from grace. Surrounded by the dead, Anton felt a strange kinship with the silent gravestones. They, too, were remnants of lives once vibrant, now reduced to mere memories. The job was monotonous and isolating, but it provided a perverse sense of peace. Yet, even in the quiet of the cemetery, Anton couldn't escape his past. Every night, as he patrolled the grounds, he was haunted by the echoes of his former life. The ghost of his career, the specter of his reputation, followed him through the darkened paths. And in the stillness, he would often hear the whispers of his own guilt, a constant reminder of the night that had destroyed everything he once held dear. Now, as Anton stood on the precipice of a new horror, faced with the unsettling events at the cemetery, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his past pressing down on him. The memories of his fall from grace mingled with the present terror, creating a tapestry of fear and regret that threatened to unravel him completely. After the incident at school, Anton trudged home under a bleak, overcast sky. His mind was a whirlwind of anxiety and disbelief. He had hoped that the truth would prevail, that people would understand it was a misunderstanding. As he approached his apartment, dread settled deep in his stomach. When he opened the door, the sight that greeted him was a chilling confirmation of his worst fears. His wife, Larissa, stood in the living room with a cold, resolute expression. Beside her were packed suitcases and boxes, a stark testament to the upheaval his life had become. "Larissa, what's going on?" Anton's voice trembled, though he tried to maintain a facade of calm. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she handed him a letter, her hands shaking slightly. It was from the school, detailing his termination and the allegations against him. Anton felt a surge of frustration and despair. "You need to leave," Larissa said finally, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "My mother called. She heard from Alina's parents. They think you're a monster." "It's not true," Anton's voice broke. "Larissa, you know me. I would never do anything like that. It was a misunderstanding." Her eyes, once filled with love and warmth, now reflected only anger and betrayal. "Anton, I can't take this anymore. The whispers, the stares, the constant phone calls. I have to think of Irina. I can't have her around this." "Think of our daughter." Anton's voice rose, desperation creeping in. "Larissa, she needs her father. You can't just cut me out of her life." But Larissa was unmoved. "You did this, Anton. Whether it was a misunderstanding or not, you brought this on us. You brought this on her. We can't stay here with you. It's over." The finality in her voice hit him like a physical blow. Anton's legs felt weak, and he sank onto the nearest chair. He watched, numb, as Larissa turned and walked down the hallway, their daughter's room remaining closed, a symbol of the life that was slipping through his fingers. He wanted to fight, to beg for another chance, but he knew it was futile. The scandal had poisoned everything. His career, his marriage, his reputation, all were crumbling around him. That night, Anton packed a small bag and left the home he had built with Larissa. He wandered the streets in a daze. The city that once felt so familiar now seemed cold and unwelcoming. The faces of passers-by blurred into a collective mask of judgment and disdain. In the weeks that followed, the divorce papers arrived, and Anton signed them with a shaking hand. He moved in with his elderly mother, retreating further into isolation. The bottles of alcohol became his constant companions, dulling the sharp edges of his grief and guilt. He tried to find solace in their numbing embrace, but they only deepened his sense of failure. Larissa and Irina became distant memories, ghostly presences in his haunted mind. The scandal followed him everywhere. Whenever he ventured out, he felt the eyes of the townspeople on him, heard the whispers that followed him like a dark cloud. Friends and acquaintances vanished, unwilling to associate with a man branded by such a scandal. The job at the cemetery was a last resort, a place where he could disappear from the prying eyes of society. There, among the silent graves and cold stone markers, Anton found a twisted sense of peace. The dead did not judge or whisper. They did not turn their backs on him. In the cemetery, he was just another soul lost to the world, a guardian of those who could no longer care about the sins of the living. Yet, as he patrolled the grounds each night, the specter of his past loomed large. The cemetery, with its eerie silence and creeping shadows, mirrored the desolation inside him. The echoes of his once promising life, his lost family, and shattered career followed him like a relentless ghost, ensuring he never forgot the man he used to be. As the scandal surrounding Anton unfolded, the city became a web of whispers and side glances, each thread tightening around his throat. The incident at school had quickly evolved from a contained scandal into the public's favorite topic of gossip. Anton's name was on everyone's lips, spoken in hushed tones behind closed doors and over coffee cups in the town's cafes. His colleagues distanced themselves, avoiding eye contact and quickening their pace whenever he was near. Anton had tried to salvage his private tutoring business, hoping it would provide a lifeline as he navigated the fallout. However, the parents who once entrusted him with their children's education now viewed him with suspicion and fear. One by one, the phone calls came. Parents, previously polite and friendly, spoke with strained voices as they canceled lessons, citing various excuses that rang hollow. "We've decided to take a break for the summer," one parent said. "My daughter needs more specialized help," claimed another. Anton knew the truth behind their words. The cancellations piled up, and soon his schedule was empty. His once thriving business, built on years of hard work and dedication, crumbled before his eyes. The final blow came when a longtime client, someone he considered a friend, called to cancel their sessions. The conversation was brief and awkward, filled with long pauses and mumbled justifications. Anton hung up the phone, feeling a profound sense of loss, not just of income, but of trust, of human connection. Isolation began to creep in like a cold draft through a broken window. Anton found himself retreating more and more into the confines of his small apartment. The walls seemed to close in on him, echoing with the ghosts of his past successes and the laughter of students who once admired him. The loneliness was suffocating. His mother, though supportive, could only offer so much comfort. Her health was fragile, and Anton could see the worry etched into her face, adding to his guilt. Venturing outside became an ordeal. The once familiar streets of his hometown now felt like hostile territory. He imagined every glance was filled with judgment, every murmur a condemnation. Trips to the grocery store were hurried, with Anton grabbing what he needed and rushing out, avoiding eye contact with the cashiers who once greeted him warmly. The few times he did meet the eyes of acquaintances, he was met with either awkward avoidance or outright disdain. Anton's social circle, once filled with friends and colleagues, disintegrated. Invitations to gatherings and events ceased. People he had known for years crossed the street to avoid him. The places he frequented, the local bar, the park, the bookstore, became battlegrounds where he fought the rising tide of shame and isolation. He took to walking late at night when the streets were empty, finding solace in the silence and darkness that mirrored his internal despair. His life became a series of empty days and sleepless nights. Alcohol became a companion, dulling the edges of his misery, but also dragging him deeper into a pit of self-loathing. The bottles littered his apartment, silent witnesses to his decline. Each drink was a futile attempt to escape the reality of his shattered life, but it only compounded his problems, further alienating the few who still cared. In this desolate state, the job at the cemetery emerged as his only option. It was a grim refuge, a place where he could hide from the world and his own failures. Among the graves, he found a perverse comfort in the solitude. The dead, after all, could not judge him. The cemetery became both his sanctuary and his prison, a place where he could exist unnoticed and forgotten. Yet, even in this refuge, the shadows of his past lingered. The isolation gnawed at him, each silent night a reminder of the life he once had and the desolation that now defined his existence. The weight of social ostracism was a constant companion, pressing down on him with relentless force. Anton's world had shrunk to the confines of the cemetery and the dark recesses of his mind, where regret and bitterness festered. In the silence of the graveyard, he confronted the ghost of his former self, a reminder of all he had lost and the inescapable reality of his downfall. After the scandal had decimated his life, Anton found himself standing on the doorstep of his childhood home. His mother, her face etched with worry, welcomed him back with open arms. She tried to console him, but Anton's shame and despair were too deep. The familiar surroundings of his childhood offered little comfort. Instead, they served as a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. The days stretched into an indistinguishable blur as Anton turned to alcohol to numb the relentless pain and humiliation. Bottles of cheap vodka and whiskey began to pile up around his small room, the liquid courage providing a fleeting escape from his harsh reality. The buzzed haze became his preferred state of existence, where the edges of his suffering dulled and the voices of judgment grew distant. However, each morning brought a fresh wave of regret and self-loathing, compounding his misery. As his savings dwindled, Anton realized he needed to find work. His mother's pension was barely enough to cover the household expenses, and he felt an overwhelming guilt for becoming an additional burden. He managed to secure a position as a manager in a small private company. Initially, the job seemed like a lifeline, a chance to regain some semblance of normalcy and dignity. Anton approached it with a sense of desperate determination, hoping to prove to himself and others that he could rebuild his life. For a brief period, it seemed like things might improve. Anton threw himself into his work, arriving early and staying late, trying to bury his past beneath a mountain of tasks. However, the dark allure of alcohol was never far away. The pressures of the job, coupled with his unresolved emotional turmoil, soon became too much to bear. Nights intended for rest turned into binges, where Anton sought solace in the bottom of a bottle. Inevitably, his performance at work began to suffer. Hangovers made him sluggish and irritable, and his once sharp mind became clouded and unreliable. The absences started innocently enough, calling in sick after a particularly rough night, arriving late because he couldn't drag himself out of bed. But soon, they became more frequent. His colleagues noticed his deteriorating state, whispering amongst themselves, their eyes filled with a mix of pity and disdain. The breaking point came one particularly rough morning. Anton, eyes bloodshot and hands shaking, stumbled into the office hours late. His manager, a stern woman with little patience for excuses, called him into her office. The conversation was brief and brutal. She laid out the litany of his failures, each word striking him like a physical blow. Anton sat there, unable to muster any defense, knowing deep down that she was right. The final words, "You're fired," hung in the air, sealing his fate. Leaving the office for the last time, Anton felt the weight of his failure pressing down on him. He had squandered yet another chance, driven away by the same demons that haunted his every waking moment. The walk home was a slow, torturous march, each step a reminder of his inadequacy. By the time he reached his mother's house, he was already reaching for the bottle, seeking the familiar numbness that had become his constant companion. His mother watched in silent despair as her son spiraled further into the abyss. She pleaded with him to seek help, to find a way out of the darkness, but her words fell on deaf ears. Anton was too far gone, consumed by a toxic cocktail of guilt, shame, and addiction. The once promising teacher, the man who had inspired so many, was now a broken shell, lost in a fog of his own making. The months that followed were a bleak and unending cycle of self-destruction. Anton's life became confined to the small, dimly lit room he now called home. The curtains remained drawn, keeping the world at bay. His days were spent in a stupor, punctuated only by trips to the liquor store to restock his dwindling supplies. The outside world moved on without him, leaving Anton to wallow in his own despair. Each day bled into the next, the passage of time marked only by the increasing number of empty bottles that cluttered his room. The once vibrant, ambitious man was now a ghost, haunting the very place where he had once found comfort and security. His mother's desperate attempts to reach him grew less frequent, her own strength waning under the strain of watching her son's relentless decline. In this desolate state, Anton's fall from grace was complete. He had lost not only his career and reputation, but also his very sense of self. The man who had once stood before a classroom full of eager students, inspiring them to reach for greatness, was now a shadow, lurking in the corners of his own life. And as the world outside continued to turn, Anton remained trapped in a purgatory of his own making, a testament to the devastating power of addiction and despair. The final light of dusk cast long shadows across the graveyard, where the crumbling tombstones stood like silent sentinels among the gnarled, leafless trees. The air was thick with a cold, damp fog that seemed to seep into the very bones of the place, creating an eerie silence that was only broken by the occasional rustle of dead leaves. This desolate scene was a mirror to Anton's own life, a life of solitude, regret, and unending routine. Anton's nightly rounds through the graveyard had become a ritual, one that offered little solace but much time for reflection. Tonight, however, was different. As he approached the old section of the cemetery, where the oldest graves lay forgotten and overgrown, he saw something that set his teeth on edge. A group of teenagers, clad in dark clothing and sporting various Gothic accessories, were huddled near one of the tombstones. Their presence was an intrusion into the sanctity of the dead and a disruption of the monotony he had grown accustomed to. "Hey," Anton shouted, his voice cracking the silence like a whip. The teenagers turned, their faces lit by the pale glow of their phone screens, showing expressions that ranged from defiance to fear. One of them, a tall boy with dyed black hair and a studded jacket, stepped forward, trying to mask his nervousness with bravado. "What do you think you're doing here?" Anton demanded, striding closer, his flashlight beam dancing across their faces. "We're not doing anything wrong," the boy replied, his voice steady but his eyes darting nervously. "You're trespassing and disturbing the graves," Anton snapped. His hand went to his belt, where a small, battered pistol hung, a relic from his days of misguided self-defense preparations. He drew it now, pointing it at the ground, but letting the threat hang in the air. The tension ratcheted up several notches. The teenagers froze, their earlier bravado melting away. Anton's grip on the flashlight tightened, his knuckles whitening. Without warning, he swung the flashlight in a wide arc, the heavy metal casing connecting with the head of the tall boy. The boy crumpled to the ground, clutching his head where blood began to seep through his fingers. The other teenagers gasped, backing away with wide eyes. Anton turned the pistol towards them, his voice a low growl. "Get out of here now, or you'll be next." "But we didn't." One of the girls started, but her voice trembled, betraying her fear. "I don't care," Anton barked. "This is a place for the dead, not for your games and vandalism. Now get out before I call the police." The teenagers glanced at each other, a mixture of fear and uncertainty in their eyes. Slowly they began to retreat, casting anxious glances back at their fallen friend, who was now struggling to his feet, groaning in pain. Anton watched them go, his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of the pistol heavy in his hand. The graveyard's oppressive silence resumed, swallowing up the echoes of their departure. As Anton stood there, his breath visible in the cold night air, he felt a shiver run down his spine. The fog seemed thicker now, the darkness deeper. The gravestones loomed larger, their inscriptions unreadable, but somehow ominous. For a moment, he felt as if the very ground beneath him was alive, watching, waiting. He shook off the sensation and holstered his pistol, resuming his rounds with a new, uneasy awareness of how easily the peace of the dead could be shattered by the living. The night was growing colder and the fog thicker as Anton stood over the huddled group of teenagers. The eerie silence of the graveyard was punctuated only by the distant hoot of an owl and the muffled sobs of the injured boy. Anton's flashlight cast long, wavering shadows that made the gravestones appear to dance menacingly in the darkness. "Get up," Anton ordered, his voice a harsh whisper against the night. "We're going to find your friend, and you're going to show me you haven't been desecrating these graves." "We didn't touch any graves," one of the girls insisted, her voice shaking with fear. "We were just looking for our friend, I swear." "I don't believe you," Anton snarled, gripping his flashlight tighter. "Move, now, or I'll call the police and let them deal with you." The threat hung heavy in the air, and the teenagers exchanged frightened glances before slowly rising to their feet. The boy with the bleeding head wound wiped his brow with a shaky hand, smearing blood across his pale face. His eyes were wide with pain and terror, reflecting the beam of Anton's flashlight. Anton led the way, the beam of his flashlight piercing the fog as they ventured deeper into the cemetery, towards the dark fringe of the forest that bordered the graves. The teenagers followed, their steps hesitant and their whispers hushed. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made them flinch, their fear palpable in the oppressive night air. "You," Anton barked, turning to face them. "Spread out and start looking. If I find out you've been lying, there will be hell to pay." The group dispersed reluctantly, casting nervous glances back at Anton, whose stern gaze and the glint of the pistol at his belt kept them moving. They fanned out, searching the underbrush and shadows with trembling hands and hushed voices, calling out for their missing friend. As they searched, Anton continued to hurl accusations and insults. "You kids think this is some kind of game? This is a graveyard, a place of respect for the dead, not your playground." One of the girls, her face streaked with tears, knelt beside a bush, her sobs barely contained. "We didn't mean any harm. We just want to find Mike and go home." "Shut up and keep looking," Anton snapped, his eyes scanning the dark trees for any sign of movement. The fog seemed to swallow their cries, making the search feel even more hopeless and claustrophobic. The injured boy, struggling to keep up, finally sank to his knees, clutching his bleeding head. I can't do this," he whimpered, his voice breaking. The sight of his pain only seemed to fuel Anton's anger. "Get up," Anton growled, looming over the boy. "You're not done yet. None of you are done until we find your friend." Despite their fear and exhaustion, the teenagers pressed on, driven by Anton's relentless threats. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees standing like dark, silent witnesses to their desperation. Every shadow seemed to hide a menace, every rustle a hidden danger. Hours seemed to pass, with no sign of the missing boy. The teenagers' voices grew hoarse from calling out, their movements sluggish from cold and fear. Yet Anton showed no mercy, his harsh commands driving them to continue. Finally, just as despair began to take hold, one of the boys cried out, "Over here. I found something." The group converged on the spot, where a torn piece of fabric lay caught on a branch, stained dark with what could only be blood. The sight of it sent a shiver through the group, their fear turning to a cold, hard dread. Anton stared at the bloodied fabric, his face a mask of grim determination. "Keep looking. We're close." As they resumed their search, the night seemed to grow even darker, the fog thicker, as if the graveyard itself was trying to swallow them whole. And in that suffocating darkness, the true horror of their situation began to unfold, one that none of them could have anticipated. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the fog seemed to thicken, curling around them like a living thing. The trees grew denser, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The teenagers moved slowly, their nerves frayed by the unending tension and the oppressive darkness. Anton, flashlight in hand, led the way with grim determination, though doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. "Spread out," Anton ordered, his voice cutting through the eerie silence. "We have to find him." They fanned out, the pale beams of their flashlights flickering through the mist. It wasn't long before one of the girls stumbled over something solid and fell with a cry. The others rushed to her side, their lights converging to reveal a crumbling headstone half buried in the underbrush. "Look," she said, her voice shaking as she pointed at the weathered stone. "This isn't part of the graveyard we know. Anton approached, his brow furrowing as he brushed away the moss and dirt. The name on the headstone was barely legible, but the date was clear: 1894. He felt a chill run down his spine. This grave was much older than the 1950s, the supposed start of the cemetery. "That can't be right," Anton muttered, more to himself than to the teenagers. "This section was never here, not according to the records." Another teenager called out, "There are more over here." They moved from one grave to another, revealing a cluster of old tombstones, their inscriptions worn by time, but unmistakably predating the official establishment of the cemetery. Anton's certainty began to crumble. He had walked these grounds countless times, and yet this part of the graveyard was entirely unfamiliar to him. His heart pounded in his chest as he examined the graves, noting the old-fashioned lettering and the archaic dates. The realization struck him hard: these were graves from a time long before the records claimed the cemetery had been founded. "How is this possible?" Anton whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of confusion and fear. One of the boys stepped forward, pointing at a particularly elaborate tombstone with an ornate cross. "See? We told you this place was older. It's like it's been hidden all this time." Anton shook his head, trying to dispel the growing sense of unease. "No, it doesn't make sense. I would have known about this." But the evidence was undeniable. Each grave they uncovered was another piece of the puzzle, a chilling testament to a past that had somehow been forgotten or hidden. The teenagers watched Anton, their fear momentarily eclipsed by the shock of their discovery. They had come looking for their friend, but now they were uncovering something far more sinister. Anton's aggressive demeanor faltered, replaced by a deep, unsettling doubt. He had always prided himself on knowing every inch of the cemetery, yet here was proof that he had been wrong. His grip on the flashlight tightened as he struggled to process the implications. What else was hidden in these woods? What other secrets lay buried beneath the soil? The mist seemed to close in around them, and Anton felt a shiver run through him. The air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. He took a step back, his confidence shaken. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice losing its earlier authority. "We still have to find your friend." But as they continued their search, a new fear gripped Anton. If these graves had been hidden for so long, what else might be lurking in the darkness, waiting to be uncovered? The forest seemed to watch them, its ancient secrets whispering just out of reach, and for the first time, Anton felt truly lost in the place he thought he knew so well. As they pushed further into the forgotten section of the cemetery, the air grew colder, and an unnatural silence settled over the group. The fog thickened, clinging to their skin and muffling their footsteps. The teenagers huddled close, their flashlights casting long, trembling shadows that seemed to dance and writhe among the gravestones. Anton led the way, his unease mounting with each step. The discovery of the old graves had unsettled him, but he pressed on, driven by a desperate need to maintain control. The beam of his flashlight flickered across the gnarled trees and ancient tombstones, casting eerie reflections in the mist. "Keep looking," Anton commanded, though his voice lacked its usual force. "We have to find your friend." They moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the underbrush and the dark spaces between the trees. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. The tension was palpable, each of them on edge, anticipating the worst. Suddenly, one of the girls let out a piercing scream. The sound shattered the silence, echoing through the cemetery like a ghostly wail. Anton and the others rushed to her side, their flashlights converging on the source of her terror. There, in the dim light, lay a gruesome sight. A severed hand, its fingers curled in a grotesque parody of a grasp, was draped over a tombstone. A tarnished ring still encircled one of the bloody digits. The hand pointed toward the base of the grave, where the mangled body of the missing boy was displayed like a macabre offering. His lifeless form had been brutally mutilated, his chest cavity ripped open, and his entrails grotesquely arranged around him. The hollow stare of his wide-open eyes reflected the pale beams of their flashlights, and a twisted expression of agony was frozen on his face. Anton felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. He staggered back, his flashlight shaking in his trembling hand. The teenagers stood in horrified silence, their faces pale and their eyes wide with terror. The reality of what they were seeing slowly sank in, bringing with it a paralyzing fear. "It's him," one of the boys whispered, his voice breaking. "It's Mike." The group recoiled as the realization hit them. Their friend had not just gone missing, he had been brutally murdered. The implications were terrifying. They were not dealing with a simple case of vandalism or mischief. There was something far more sinister at play, something that defied rational explanation. Anton struggled to regain his composure, his mind racing. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice strained and urgent. "Now." The teenagers nodded numbly, their faces etched with fear. They turned to leave, but the path that had brought them here now seemed to twist and shift in the fog. The forest, once a familiar backdrop, had transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and unknown threats. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped in a place that defied all logic. The ancient graves, the mutilated body, the thickening fog all combined to create a nightmarish reality from which there seemed to be no escape. Anton took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Stay close," he instructed, his voice trembling. "We'll find a way out." But as they retraced their steps, the forest seemed to conspire against them, leading them in circles and deepening their sense of dread. Every path they took brought them back to the old graves, as if the cemetery itself was a living, breathing entity that refused to let them go. With each passing moment, their fear grew, feeding off the darkness and the silence. The realization that they were not alone, that something malignant was watching them, hunting them, settled heavily upon them. They had stumbled into a nightmare, and now, the only question that remained was whether they would ever wake from it. As they stood in the eerie silence, paralyzed by the gruesome discovery, a sudden flicker of light in the distance caught their attention. It emanated from the direction of the caretaker's hut, casting a pale, ghostly glow through the fog. Anton's eyes widened in horror as he realized that someone or something was watching them. "We need to go," Anton hissed, urgency lacing his voice. "Now." Without waiting for a response, he turned and bolted, his heavy boots pounding against the uneven ground. The teenagers, gripped by a primal fear, followed suit. Their footsteps echoed through the night as they raced through the twisted labyrinth of graves and gnarled trees, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. The forest seemed to close in around them, branches clawing at their clothes and faces, as if trying to pull them back into the darkness. Anton's heart pounded in his chest, his mind consumed by a singular focus: escape. Every muscle in his body screamed with exertion, but he pushed through the pain, driven by sheer terror. He stumbled over a protruding root, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and skittering across the ground. He barely managed to catch himself, scraping his palms on the rough earth. The teenagers surged past him, their eyes wide with fear, before he regained his footing and continued running, snatching up the flashlight as he went. Behind them, the light from the caretaker's hut seemed to pulse, growing brighter and more menacing. It cast long shadows that twisted and writhed like malevolent spirits, chasing them through the fog. Anton's lungs burned with each ragged breath, his legs feeling like lead. He fought against the rising tide of exhaustion and nausea, the taste of bile sharp in his throat. "Keep moving," he yelled, his voice raw. "Don't stop." The teenagers were similarly struggling, their youthful energy waning under the relentless pace and the crushing fear. One of the girls tripped, falling hard and scraping her knee. She let out a cry of pain, but forced herself to her feet, driven by the same survival instinct that propelled the others. Anton glanced back, his vision swimming, and saw the fear etched on their faces. They were all fighting against the same overwhelming dread, the same physical and emotional fatigue. Every stumble, every gasp for air was a reminder of their vulnerability, their fragility in the face of an unseen horror. The fog thickened, reducing visibility to mere feet ahead. The terrain grew more treacherous, with rocks and roots threatening to trip them at every step. Anton's pace slowed as his strength waned, but he refused to stop. The thought of what might happen if they were caught spurred him on, overriding the pain and exhaustion. Finally, they broke through the tree line and onto the path that led back to the cemetery entrance. The wrought iron gates loomed ahead, a promise of escape and safety. But as they neared, Anton's hope was dashed. The gates were shut, their rusty hinges locked tight, a grim reminder of the night's surreal and relentless nightmare. Panting and desperate, Anton and the teenagers skidded to a halt. They turned, pressing their backs against the cold metal, eyes darting around for any sign of their pursuer. The fog swirled around them, a living entity, whispering threats and promises of doom. Anton's legs finally gave out, and he sank to the ground, his body trembling with exhaustion. The teenagers collapsed beside him, their faces pale and drawn. They were physically and emotionally spent, their minds reeling from the night's horrors. For a moment, they simply sat there, huddled together in a fragile semblance of safety. The caretaker's hut was no longer visible, swallowed by the fog, but the sense of being watched, of being hunted, remained. Anton knew they couldn't stay there, exposed and vulnerable, but for now, all they could do was catch their breath and gather what little strength they had left. The night was far from over, and the cemetery still held its dark secrets close. The flickering light from the hut might have disappeared, but the unseen terror that lurked in the shadows was ever present, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. As Anton and the teenagers stumbled into a relatively safer clearing, the oppressive fog seemed to momentarily lift, offering a brief respite from the night's horrors. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, each of them drenched in sweat and trembling from exhaustion and fear. The flickering flashlight beams illuminated their pale, drawn faces, revealing the depths of their terror. Anton, his chest heaving, leaned against a tree for support. His mind raced, the night's events swirling in a chaotic torrent of images and emotions. He knew he was reaching his breaking point. Turning to the group, he made a decision that would haunt him. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice raw and desperate. "I'm done. You're on your own." The teenagers stared at him in disbelief, their eyes wide with panic. "You can't just leave us," one of the girls cried, her voice trembling. "We need you." Anton shook his head, his resolve hardening. "I've done all I can. I need to look out for myself now. I'm sorry." Without another word, he turned and began to walk away, leaving the teenagers to fend for themselves. They watched him go, their fear and despair growing with each step he took. Anton tried to block out their cries, focusing on putting as much distance as possible between himself and the cemetery. As he navigated the twisted paths, his mind was a battlefield of guilt and determination. He had to forget what had happened, to return to his monotonous existence and bury this night deep within his memories. But just as he thought he might escape, a chilling sight stopped him in his tracks. There, draped over a crumbling tombstone, was another body. This one was twisted in a grotesque pose, its limbs unnaturally splayed, eyes staring blankly into the night. The sight was even more horrifying up close, the blood-soaked ground telling the tale of a violent end. Anton recognized the mangled face. It was another of the missing teenagers. A wave of nausea washed over him. His legs threatened to give way as he took in the ghastly scene. Just then, a flicker of movement caught his eye. In the distance, illuminated by the pale light of the caretaker's hut, stood a figure in a dark cloak and peaked cap. The figure's presence was malevolent, its outline stark against the window's glow. Panic surged through Anton. He turned and fled, his heart pounding in his chest, a wild rhythm of terror. He needed to find a way out, to escape the twisted maze of the cemetery. But every path he took seemed to loop back on itself, leading him in circles. The teenagers, driven by their own survival instincts, followed him closely. They too felt the oppressive weight of being trapped, the cemetery's ancient layout conspiring against their escape. No matter which direction they ran, they always ended up back among the gravestones, the fog closing in around them. With each failed attempt to break free, their fear and frustration grew. The realization that they were caught in a nightmarish trap gnawed at their sanity. The fog seemed to whisper taunts, mocking their futile efforts. Desperation turned to hysteria. One of the boys screamed in frustration, kicking at a gravestone. Another collapsed to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. Anton, now equally lost and terrified, tried to rally them, but his own voice shook with fear. "We have to keep trying," he urged, though his own hope was dwindling. There has to be a way out. But deep down, he knew the truth. They were ensnared in a malevolent force that defied logic and reality. The cemetery was more than just a resting place for the dead. It was a prison of nightmares, and they were its latest captives. As the night wore on, their attempts to escape became more frantic, each failure eroding their courage. The sinister figure in the cloak remained a constant, unyielding presence, watching from the shadows, its purpose as inscrutable as the darkness itself. As they stumbled through the mist-shrouded cemetery, Anton and the teenagers felt a flicker of hope. Ahead, through the tangled branches and gravestones, they spotted a path that seemed to lead to the edge of the graveyard. In the dim light, they could make out the outlines of what looked like garage structures, a beacon of normalcy and safety amid the chaos. "Look, there's the way out," one of the teenagers exclaimed, her voice tinged with desperate optimism. Without hesitation, they followed the path, hearts pounding with the possibility of escape. The trees thinned, and the shadows seemed less oppressive. As they moved closer to what they believed were the garages, their steps quickened, a collective sense of relief washing over them. But as they rounded the final bend, their relief turned to horror. Instead of finding the garages in freedom, they were back among the gravestones, standing in the very heart of the old cemetery. The realization hit them like a physical blow they had never left. The cemetery had twisted and turned their path, leading them back into its depths. Anton's heart sank. He glanced around, seeing the despair etched on the faces of the teenagers. "This place is playing tricks on us," he muttered, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "It doesn't want us to leave." The teenagers, now visibly shaking, began to grasp the full extent of their predicament. "We're trapped," one of them whispered, her voice barely audible. "We'll never get out of here." Desperation gave way to a chilling sense of hopelessness. They huddled together, seeking comfort in their shared fear. The fog seemed to thicken around them, the air growing colder with each passing moment. Every attempt to find an escape route had only deepened their entrapment, and now the cemetery felt more like a malevolent entity, toying with their minds and souls. As they stood in the oppressive silence, a flickering light appeared in the distance. It swayed back and forth, cutting through the darkness like a spectral beacon. Anton squinted, trying to make out the source of the light. Slowly, it drew closer, revealing the silhouette of the cemetery's caretaker. The figure was tall and imposing, cloaked in a tattered coat that seemed to absorb the darkness around it. In one hand, he held a kerosene lamp, its flame casting eerie shadows on his gaunt, hollow face. His eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to hold the weight of countless secrets and unspeakable horrors. The teenagers recoiled in terror. Anton felt his blood run cold. The caretaker's presence was suffused with an unnatural menace, an aura of dread that spoke to the ancient evil lurking within the cemetery. His slow, deliberate steps echoed in the stillness, each one a reminder of their impending doom. As the caretaker approached, his gaze fixed upon the group, a cruel smile crept across his lips. The sight of him, with his grim attire and the flickering lamp, was the embodiment of their worst fears. He stopped a few paces away, his eyes boring into theirs, and raised the lamp higher, illuminating the ghastly scene around them. In that moment, Anton and the teenagers realized the horrifying truth. They were not just lost in a physical maze, but ensnared in a nightmarish trap that defied reality. The cemetery, with its endless gravestones and ghostly caretaker, had claimed them as its own. Their fate was sealed, and escape was no longer an option. The caretaker's voice, when it finally came, was a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down their spines. "You should not have come here," he intoned, each word dripping with malevolence. "Now, you will join the others, forever bound to this cursed ground." Anton felt a wave of despair wash over him. The realization of their inescapable doom settled heavily on his shoulders. He had led them into this nightmare, and now there was no way out. As the caretaker's lamp flickered ominously, the group stood frozen in terror, awaiting the final act of their harrowing ordeal. As the spectral caretaker stepped closer, his form seemed to grow and shift, morphing into a monstrous figure that loomed over the group. He was now a giant, at least 1.5 times the height of an average man, his once human features distorted into something nightmarish. Dark tendrils slithered out from beneath his tattered cloak, writhing with a life of their own. The teenagers gasped in horror, their courage draining away like water through a sieve. One of the boys, known among his friends as Harry for his unruly mop of hair, tried to summon his bravado. Desperation fueled his actions as he stooped to pick up a large rock, his hand trembling yet determined. "I'm not afraid of you," he yelled, his voice breaking with a mix of fear and defiance. He hurled the rock with all his might. The rock struck the monstrous caretaker, but it barely seemed to notice. Instead, the creature's black eyes glinted with a malevolent amusement. With horrifying speed, one of the tendrils shot out, wrapping around Harry's neck and lifting him off the ground. The boy struggled, kicking and clawing at the air, but the caretaker was relentless. With a sickening crunch, the creature smashed Harry's head against a gravestone, silencing his cries forever. Blood splattered across the ancient stone, a stark reminder of their dire situation. The remaining teenagers screamed and scattered, but there was no escape. The caretaker's tendrils lashed out, ensnaring them one by one. Anton, frozen in sheer terror, watched the horrific scene unfold. His mind screamed at him to move, to do something, but his body refused to obey. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the nightmarish reality before him. One by one, the teenagers fell. The caretaker dispatched them with brutal efficiency, each death more gruesome than the last. The air was filled with their cries of pain and terror, punctuated by the grotesque sounds of flesh-meeting stone. Anton's heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drumbeat that drowned out all rational thought. Finally, the caretaker turned his gaze toward Anton. The monstrous figure towered over him, the tendrils retracting back into the cloak, leaving a trail of blood and gore in their wake. For a moment their eyes locked, and Anton felt a cold dread seep into his very soul. The caretaker seemed to savor the fear in his eyes, a twisted smile playing on his lips. But then, as if deciding he had had enough, the caretaker stepped back into the shadows, leaving Anton standing alone amidst the carnage. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Anton's ragged breathing and the distant rustle of the night. He stood there, surrounded by the lifeless bodies of the teenagers, the weight of his own survival pressing heavily upon him. The reality of what had just occurred was too much to process. His legs buckled, and he sank to the ground, trembling uncontrollably. Anton was the last one left, a solitary witness to the massacre. He had led them into this nightmare, and now he was the only one to walk away. As he knelt there, his mind numb with shock, he knew that this night would haunt him forever. The memory of the monstrous caretaker and the brutal deaths of the teenagers would be etched into his soul, a permanent scar that would never heal. Stumbling back to his ramshackle cottage, Anton felt like he was dragging a leaden weight with every step. His clothes were caked with mud and blood, a grim testament to the horrors he had witnessed. As he reached his front door, his trembling hands struggled to find the key. Once inside, he slumped against the wall, sliding down to sit on the cold, hard floor. His breath came in ragged gasps, the enormity of what had transpired threatening to overwhelm him. He forced himself to move, to shed the filthy clothes that clung to his skin like a second, accursed layer. Each item fell to the floor with a heavy thud, and he kicked them aside, not wanting to look at the stains of terror and death. He crossed the room to the old television set, turning it on more out of habit than desire. The flickering images and the low hum of the screen provided a semblance of normalcy, a small anchor in a sea of madness. Reaching for his flask, Anton took several deep gulps of the harsh liquor, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction from the turmoil in his mind. He sank into the worn armchair, the weight of exhaustion pulling him down. His eyes drifted to the clock on the wall, noting the late hour with a detached sense of awareness. A sudden jolt of reality hit him as he noticed his phone on the small table beside the chair. The screen glowed with missed notifications. With a shaking hand, he picked it up and saw 12 missed calls from his ex-wife, Larissa. They hadn't spoken in a year, and her persistent attempts to reach him sent a shiver down his spine. His fingers felt clumsy as he dialed her number, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and dread. The phone rang only once before Larissa's voice came through, strained and choked with emotion. "Anton," she began, her voice cracking. "I've been trying to reach you. Something terrible has happened." His heart lurched. "What is it? What's wrong?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's IRA," she said, and the world seemed to stop. She's gone, Anton. There was an accident. She's dead." The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. He sat there, stunned, unable to process the information. A wave of grief and guilt crashed over him, and he felt like he was drowning in it. As he sat there, the room began to change. The familiar hum of the television grew distorted, and the screen flickered, displaying an image of old gravestones, eerily similar to the ones he had seen earlier. Anton blinked, trying to clear his vision, but the scene remained. The caretaker from the cemetery appeared on the screen, his kerosene lamp casting an unholy light. The figure stepped out of the television, towering over Anton. The room filled with a cacophony of voices, the whispers of the dead mingling with the flickering light. The caretaker's eyes bore into him, and when he spoke, it was with the combined voices of countless souls. Anton, the caretaker intoned, "You are already one of us. Your life ended long ago. You are merely a ghost, wandering through the remnants of your existence." Anton felt a cold chill seep into his bones, his mind reeling from the supernatural encounter. The caretaker's words echoed the despair he felt within, the sense of being adrift and disconnected from the world of the living. He stared at the specter, feeling his sanity slip away, consumed by the darkness that had claimed his soul.